Hi, so this week we're looking at Chapter 7, which is Theories of Motivation. In this chapter, I've decided to look at the chapter and the theories and divide them into content theories, or what motivates us, and process theories, how motivation works. There are two different sets of theories, so it's easier to divide them and spend a little more time talking about them in depth. So you'll find that in this chapter, in the textbook, the chapter goes over some of them in a more cursory manner, and I go over them in a little more detail. So pay attention to what we're talking about in the PowerPoints and in this lecture, and also pay attention to what is in the chapter. So when we say we're motivated, what are we actually talking about? And we'll look at issues such as how can we be motivated to do something, or we seem motivated to do something, but our performance doesn't reflect our motivation. Why is motivation, which is the psychological set of theories, important to the study of organizational behavior? And what are some of the challenges that we face in motivating employees? So first of all, we need to look at what motivation is. And we have some definitions for you in the PowerPoints. But basically, motivation refers to our desire to achieve something, to direct and sustain our energy towards performing something to the best of our ability. So motivation involves intensity and persistence that we have towards a goal, and it's related to our individual characteristics. So we go back to things like self-efficacy again, locus of control, our ability, our perception of the role, whether we think we can do something or not. So there are many different theories of motivation, as we'll see, both this week and next week, and there's no right or wrong theory, just different ways to approach what and how we're studying it. So it's a different lens, again, a different set of glasses that we put on in order to study the same problem or the same situation. So we're looking at why someone is motivated to do something, and we can look at a number of different theories to take that approach. So before we look at the theories, we need to talk about the types of motivation, or the types of motivators that there are. So there's intrinsic motivation, or motivators, and that means that the motivation comes from within us. So we might feel good if we've done well on a test or an assignment. Nobody's praising us, but that feeling of good that we get is what we call intrinsic motivation. Or we do something just because of the sheer pleasure and joy that it gives us, and that's intrinsic motivation. I give you an example. We go to the gym, that wouldn't be me, because we enjoy doing it. This is intrinsic motivation, and the motivation that, or the pleasure we get from that, leads us to continue that particular performance. Extrinsic motivation is a situation, or the motivator, whereby the motivator comes from outside of us, or is administered by someone else. So money, recognition, promotion, praise, rewards are examples of extrinsic motivation. So if we get a bonus pay, that's extrinsic motivation, and it's influenced by someone else. Now, if we get praise, for example, someone says we're doing a good job, that's external motivation, or extrinsic motivation rather, but it could also have a secondary effect. It could also act intrinsically. The praise makes us feel good about ourselves, therefore we go on to perform as well. So it can cause that feeling inside as well. Now, between the two of them, intrinsic motivation is seen as the more positive of the two, because extrinsic motivation can tend to be less effective over time. It doesn't necessarily lead to behavior, and it can set a different set of expectations and harm intrinsic motivation if it's not done correctly. So intrinsic motivation is the more positive of the two. We touch briefly, and the book touches briefly, on early theories of motivation, which are listed. I'm not going to go over them at this point. You can read about them, and you can see them in the PowerPoints as well. The Protestant work ethic is also touched on, talked about, because the study of motivation is strongly linked to the Protestant work ethic, which stresses hard work for the sake of hard work, frugal living, etc. And today, the environment we are raised in helps determine our work ethic and our motivation. So the two are still linked. Motivation and job performance, which gets us to the OB aspect, is related because successful job performance depends on both our effort and our ability. And these are related to motivation because individuals who have the ability and don't make the effort, not motivated but can do the job, is important to study and look at, whereas others make the effort but don't have the ability, motivated but can't do the job, are important questions to look at and to study in terms of motivation. So why is it that someone has the ability but doesn't necessarily make the effort? What can be done and how can this be explained in terms of motivation theory? And how is it that others make the effort but don't have the ability? Again, having a look at that. So the challenge of motivating employees in the workforce is matching employees to jobs so that you don't get the case where someone does the work but doesn't have the ability. So a person-job match, making sure the person has the ability, and very importantly, matching motivators to the person so that the person will make the effort. So if you're going to reward someone for doing something, you've got to make sure that what you're rewarding them with, matching the motivators, is something that they desire. So I said a few minutes ago that I wouldn't be motivated or feel intrinsically motivated if I went to the gym because that's just not my thing. So if I were to be offered a gym membership, for example, that wouldn't be properly matching the motivator to me because it wouldn't encourage me to do something because it wouldn't be something that I would be desiring. So that's key. Recognizing that there's a changing workforce, so younger employees have different needs and values. Older employees have different needs and values. There's a whole series of literature and work on aging employees in the workforce and looking at what people want, and as I said, the younger ones. Diverse workforces can have different needs and values, so work-family balance, recognizing different needs for people from different cultures is important. Layoffs and restructuring in organizations create motivation issues, damaged trust, lack of commitment can result from this if an organization is going through restructuring and people are uncertain if they're going to keep their jobs. Flatter organizations with fewer supervisors to monitor performance if it's something that needs to be monitored in order to reinforce or pay bonuses for, so that can be a problem or a challenge in motivating employees. So these are things to keep in mind. Which brings us to where we're basically going to start as the overview for this chapter, the next two classes. As I said, the content or needs theories of motivation, i.e. what motivates people, versus content or versus process theories of motivation, which explains how someone with a particular need behaves in a certain way, or how motivation works. So the theories that we're going to touch on, or that we touch on in this chapter, are ones that may be somewhat familiar to you: Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Alderfer's ERG theory, Theory X and Theory Y, Hertzberg's motivation hygiene theories, and McClelland's learned needs theories. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I present as a hierarchy, you can see it in the PowerPoints, different ways of presenting it, basically says that all humans have needs which underline their motivation structure. So the focus is on psychological well-being, and Maslow argues that human needs exist in a hierarchical structure, and those at the top of the pyramid or the top of the structure are referred to as growth needs and are intrinsically motivated, so it's feelings that come from within, self-actualization and esteem. And the ones at the bottom, the basic needs, are extrinsically motivated. So physiological needs, safety needs, food, shelter, clothing, friendship, safety, knowing that you have a job. So Maslow's argument is that as the lower needs are satisfied, they no longer primarily drive the behavior. and the higher needs become motivating. So satisfaction progression process is what he calls that. He says that if the needs are not being met, so we progress in a hierarchy, we move up the hierarchy, but if our needs are not being met at the lower level, if something, let's say, we lose our job, so our safety need disappears, and maybe we've moved up to esteem, that will regress back to that level until that set of needs is met. So it's a very rigid hierarchy, and this regression is called the frustration hypothesis, that we move backwards, and that no two needs can operate at the same time. So we do move through it in strict order. So obviously there have been some issues with Maslow's model in that it's seen as too rigid and too hierarchical. Studies on countries at war show different needs are operating, for example. We also know that gratification at one level, fulfillment of needs at one level, doesn't always lead to the next level of motivation. His model is difficult to test, and it doesn't explain how to motivate people, for example, how to move beyond the lower level needs. What is it that needs to be done for these higher level needs, the intrinsic level needs? And cultural differences are not taken into account. For example, China's collectivist behavior favors esteem and social elements over self-needs. So how is that explained? It's not in Maslow's model. So the next person up was Alderfer, who took Maslow's model and refined it and shrunk it to three levels of needs: existence, relatedness, and growth, the ERG theory. That's where the ERG comes from. And it's much more streamlined, and it has some differences in that Alderfer is less rigid and says if the higher level needs are not satisfied, the next lower level need takes precedence. This is the satisfaction regression, but that all three sets of needs can operate at once because there's no hierarchy. However, lower level needs tend to dominate. So individuals can move from one set of needs to another according to what they need. And his model is seen as more advanced because it can explain why employees' needs change over time, and therefore, in turn, why employers should be able to motivate more than one set of needs at any given time. So it's less hierarchical, it's more streamlined. So those are two models that focus on basic and intrinsic needs. McClelland's learned needs model is a different model in that the previous two theories we looked at assumed that needs are instinctive, that they come from instinct. However, McClelland suggests that secondary needs, which are important motivators and reinforced through social norms or early learning through our parents, drive our behavior and are learned and are important sources of motivation. So McClelland argues that we have three sets of learned needs, and we behave depending on how these needs come forward. So we can have a need for power, we can have a need for achievement, or a strong need, primary need, or a strong need for affiliation. And these are learnt over time. And if we have a need for power, then these need to be fulfilled in a certain way. And if we have a need for achievement, these will be fulfilled in another way, and affiliation in yet another way. So how people behave, as they say, depends on their needs. But in terms of the workplace, this can translate into, if you were a manager and you wanted to motivate someone with a high need for achievement, then you would recognize perhaps that you should give them praise or recognize their achievement with some sort of reinforcement. Whereas if they have a high need for affiliation, maybe working in a team would be better than individual work. A high need for power, you could look at that and manage that by maybe making someone a team leader or recognizing it within that. Now you may wonder, how do you know that people have these learned needs? Well, there is an achievement, not an achievement test, but a test for McClelland's needs that you can take similarly to other tests that we've looked at. It's not a personality test, but it shows you where you would score high on each of those three categories, and can take it from there and work within those combines. The next model is the hygiene or motivator hygiene model, Hertzberg's two-factor model. It goes by different names. And this takes a slightly different focus, and it looks at and recognizes the importance of job characteristics as motivators. So what is it within the job that motivates people to work, and what is it within the job that doesn't motivate, but if it's not there, it'll cause dissatisfaction? So Hertzberg breaks this down, the two-factor motivator hygiene model, into a distinction between factors that motivate employees, so these can be intrinsic motivators, and those that cause work dissatisfaction or hygiene factors if they're not present. So they contribute to the development of the motivating potential of the job, and you can look at them and say, well, if they're there, are they more motivating if they're there, or if they're not there, what is the reaction or the result going to be? So I give you a list of some examples. So if the hygiene factors are not there, then we will notice and will be dissatisfied. But if they are there, they're not necessarily going to make us more motivated. Whereas the presence of motivators will lead to motivation. So for example, hygiene factors relate to the context of the job security, supervision, salary, working conditions, flexible benefits. So to give you an example, we could say we walk in and the working conditions could be very comfortable, so we don't think about the temperature of our office or the temperature of our conditions to conduct our work. But if suddenly we go in and the heat is off and the office is very cold, or we find that we have to work outside in a snowstorm, that's a hygiene factor. So if they're there, we don't think about it. We don't come in and say, oh, the office is 20 degrees, I'm more motivated to work. But if we come in and the office is freezing, we're going to be dissatisfied and less motivated to work. Whereas a motivator, promotion, recognition for doing the job, the content of the job, they tend to relate more to achievement. If they're there, according to Hertzberg, these will motivate us to perform better. So hygiene factors relate to the context of the job, and motivators relate to the content of the job, and the two have very different outcomes according to him. So some of the critiques of this theory are that some of the hygiene factors can also be seen as motivators. So we could take that in terms of pay. That could be both an intrinsic and an extrinsic motivator, both a hygiene factor and both a motivator. And we know that job satisfaction doesn't necessarily lead to higher productivity. We can be very happy with our job and very satisfied with our job, but it doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily work harder at it. And despite replicating the studies with similar results, other studies show different results with this particular model. So in South Africa, for example, unskilled workers are more satisfied with hygiene factors. In China, hygiene factors, according to a study done in 1999, contribute to motivation. So cultural boundaries have to be taken into account as well. McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y, I won't spend much time on that. It's basically management's view in Theory X that employees are lazy and resistant to change and need supervision, where Theory Y views employees as hardworking and wanting to succeed. So this has implications for how to manage with a more participatory style and what kinds of needs are satisfied, which in turn leads to motivation. So overall, the implications for content theories for managers are for us to know that people have different needs at different times based on values, personality, etc., and that there should be a choice of rewards, a flexible reward system. So it isn't one reward for all, but it's tailoring the rewards to who needs what. Not to rely too heavily on financial rewards, as they mainly address lower level needs, and don't forget that intrinsic rewards, as I said earlier, were more valued. Don't underestimate the power of lower level needs, though, if they're not there, and don't underestimate intrinsic motivation, and don't rely solely on individualism. Think of group-based rewards as well. So that's an overview of what motivation is and what the theories of content theories of motivation are. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about the same chapter, but process theories of motivation, or how the process of motivation works, and how that unpacks with expectancy theory and equity theory as two examples. Okay, so have a good week.